So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining. This is Curt Sassak. Hey, I have Mr. Martin C. Duffy, and he has been kind enough to join us today. And he is a brand representative and a whiskey educator. And actually, his background, I'm looking at it here, he's like done a little bit of everything. I would even go so far as to call him a whiskey maestro. But at any rate, he's got an extensive background in the adult beverage world, in particular with whiskey. And we're going to talk about whiskey and, among other things, beverage trends and things like that. So, hey, Martin, thank you for joining, man.
Thanks for asking me on, Curt. This is going to be fun.
Awesome. So, your background is not like, there's plenty of wine reps, beer reps, spirits reps, and I don't mean that in to sound negative, but your job is a bit unique. You've been a brand ambassador for Diego. You've been a brand ambassador you were actually one of the first ones for Johnny Walker, if I'm not mistaken.
I was one of the first brand ambassadors ever.
Oh, okay.
There weren't brand ambassadors before I'm on.
Okay. So would you
How about that to blow your mind?
Wow. That's pretty cool. So would you kindly tell, I'm sorry, the video froze there for a second. Could you repeat that?
About the brand ambassadors?
Yeah, so you were one of the first ever brand ambassadors.
That's right. There were no brand ambassadors before there were the Masters of Scotch.
Okay. So
excuse me.
I have a two-pronged question for you. The first is, could you briefly tell people how you went from venturing your way into the adult beverage industry to becoming a brand ambassador, especially when there was no brand ambassador like position before you?
Sure. It started in the 80s. I started in the restaurant industry because, like most people with great charisma and good looks, I was an actor. I used to perform with the likes of Steve Carell and Andy Dick and a bunch of people who went on to make almost as much money as I make. But as most people did in my time, when you were an actor, you got into the restaurant industry because it was the most flexible as far as your hours. So I was a waiter, and then I got into bartending. I liked bartending. The crazy thing is the early 90s, and there was no way to really learn about spirits. There were no brand ambassadors. There were no one going around training you. It's really, really odd. Even brand reps, distributor reps really couldn't tell you much about the actual info on the spirits itself. So I started doing promotions on the side, and those promotions would train you on the brands. And then slowly but surely, this evolved and into a full-time position where I started working as a master of Scotch for Johnny Walker and the classic malts. This was the beginning of a 14-year span where I was eventually a senior master of whiskey representing Johnny Walker, the classic malts, which is a huge array of Diageo single malts, Bushmills Irish whiskey, Bullet bourbon, George Dickel Tennessee whiskey, and Crown Royal Canadian whiskey. So just a great girth of knowledge there, on the different categories of whiskey. That eventually I left Diageo and got a job with Benedictine. Here, a little Benedictine for any of you who have forgotten. A little Benedictine, French liqueur. I did that for about 18 months as a national brand ambassador, but that wasn't really my thing. It was great, and it's a great brand, but it was just not a good fit for me. So in the meantime, I started co-producing the Chicago Independent Spirit Expo with my friend Dave Schmier, who owned Redemption Rye. He founded Redemption Rye, sold it. Now he owns a number of other brands, including a rum and a Geneva and a couple of whiskeys. And then about overlapping all this, about 2014 is when the Davidson family at Glencairn Crystal in Scotland, who I've been friends with since they launched the Glencairn Glass in 2001, they needed somebody in North America. They asked, "Hey, what are you doing? Would you like to come work for us?" And so I went to go work for them. And now to this very day, I'm the sole brand representative in North America and kind of South America. I'm hoping to get down there at some point. And so I travel the country attending whiskey shows, visiting distilleries, reaching out to events and other possible customers, and just spreading the word. I'm spreading the word around the world. Thank you very much for Glencairn Crystal.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I went on Glencairn's site and impressive. And there is the. Do you want to touch on? I see there. Actually, I'm sorry. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. We'll come back to Glencairn.
Mm-hmm.
So how? Before you, there was no brand ambassadors. How did that come about? Did maybe Johnny Walker see what you're doing and they said, "Hey, you want to just work for us?" Or how did you go from no brand ambassador? Like, what was the transition to that? How did that happen?
The thing was, back then in the 90s, they got the idea of bringing over Scottish distillers. Most of these guys had just retired, so they're distiller emerituses, and they would come over and they do dinners and they would do market visits and some staff trainings, but very few. I mean, their time was limited. Bringing them over from Scotland was costly. Putting them up, trying to bring them around to different markets. Plus, all these guys were at this point probably in their mid to late 60s. So there was a marketing fella. Ian Coburn was his name. Really nice guy. Looked like Donald Pleasance. He lived over in Scotland. He came up with the idea of hiring locals who could be trained on the whiskeys. And thus we would have a segment. There were 7 of us originally. And I was given 12 states, everything from the Dakotas to West Virginia. It was basically me up in the north. And I travel to each market, make market visits constantly. And it was funny because there was no job description when I started. I think it was January 2nd I started, 2003, full-time with this whole new plan. I had already been working 7 years part-time, but this was full-time, boom, right in the market. And then we went, well, what do I do? And so luckily I had a great, it was back when Shefflin Somerset was still around. This is just as Diageo, the company, was forming, hadn't really formed yet. It was coming together as parts of Seagram and United Distillers and Guinness. And then they decided, one of my market managers just said, put Marty in the market with a rep every day for 3 days a week for the next month. And that really got me going. That was great. Just making the account relationships and intros was huge. That was the beginning of a long and fruitful relationship in the liquor industry.
Oh, cool. So so Glencairn, okay, I'm on the website right now. I'm looking at it. And obviously, I would assume that the effort that goes into creating a whiskey glass that benefits the drinker is the same for a wine glass. So I'm here looking at your site. It says why the glass works, the science behind the Glencairn glass. Do you want to touch on, the science behind why a whiskey glass is shaped the way it is, and
Sure,
and the science behind it, and how that benefits the drinker?
A little background on the glass. Raymond Davidson was the founder of Glencairn. He started it to make decanters for the whiskey business. This is back in their early 80s.
Oh, I didn't know you would decant whiskey.
Well, sure. Yeah. You've never seen the fancy decanters for whiskey? Oh, sure.
Actually, I have, but I never thought about it.
Yeah, it's not the same as wine. It's not like decanting wine to,
Right, right.
but a little aeration does wonders for some whiskeys. Um, and plus he also made the special bottlings, crystal decanters that you'll see on 63-year-old, Glenfarclas and Macallan and all those. But he noticed that there was no glass specifically for drinking whiskey. You had whiskey tumblers, the rocks glasses that you get in a lot of bars. There was the brandy snifter, but that was really meant kind of for brandy. And even then, it wasn't ideal. It's not what the brandy makers would use. So actually, he took a brandy glass, looked at it, took some of the best parts, the bulb, the neck, and then he put it on a shelf for about 19 years until his son picked it up and said, "Dad, what's this?" It's an idea, but I don't think it'll ever catch on. And his son really liked it. He said, "Let's do it." And then they launched in 2001 at Whiskey Fest, New York. And now it's a staple at almost every whiskey event. Now, the science behind it, you got the bulb where you put your whiskey, right? Now, the aromas, all the esters of the whiskey start raising up, and the chimney just brings it straight up to the nose, whereas most other glasses, they're wider. Now, we brought in 5 different master blenders from 5 different blending houses in Scotland. People like Richard Patterson, who's still active. These guys were very instrumental in deciding the height, the width of the bulb, the height of the chimney, the width of the mouth. A lot of that really does matter. Even the width of the glass, the rim. Anyone who's into wine, you recognize, you can't really drink wine out of a thick glass. That's why Riedel is a wonderful wine glass. But the other thing is it's durable. Now we do have a crystal Glencairn for the fancier folks. They're a little more, they're a lot more expensive, about 10 times the cost of a standard glass, this is still crystal, but we use barium, which is a lot less expensive, but it adds the clarity to the glass. So that's about that in a nutshell, I think.
Yeah.
Did I miss anything?
Yeah, just like wine glasses.
Curt,
every
you're
wine
frozen.
glass has a purpose. Say again?
Right. And we do that. We've done the same, just like the wine industry. We've expanded. We have the mixer glass. This was created originally for Canadian whiskey, but it's been adopted by those folks in Kentucky and Tennessee, mainly because it's large enough to not only nose, but you can then drop an ice ball, nice size ice cube in there. We also have, for tasting rooms, the wee Glencairn. Nice. The guys in Scotland would pour their samples in a standard Glencairn glass, and they said our samples look so tiny and minuscule that they asked us to make a wee one to make it not so minuscule. So yeah, and this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg. We have stem copitas. We do still make crystal tumblers, beautiful rock glasses, and matching decanters with them, and just about any kind of glass anybody would want. But obviously, these are our top sellers and the ones that the industry really kind of gravitates to.
And on that note, because that's related to how you serve, I've seen different discussion, as I understand it, for a quality scotch or whiskey, regardless where it's from, you don't want to go putting ice and stuff in it. Maybe just a little splash of tap water. Could you just tell people what's the general etiquette when it comes to drinking, a higher end scotch, and what's acceptable if it's, say, a lower end?
Well, the thing is, I don't even look at whiskey that way, higher end, lower end, because there's some beautiful whiskeys that are very inexpensive. And
Okay.
so some people might think, oh, they're cheap, but no, at the same time, you'll have whiskeys like Old Granddad that have become bartenders' favorites. Powers among Irish whiskeys was always considered, that's just kind of old man's Irish whiskey. Now that's an Irish whiskey that, again, bartenders love. And if you go over to Ireland, that's really the whiskey that people, at least around Dublin, you'll see loads of Powers being served. How you drink it is really up to you. I like certain whiskeys on ice. I like other whiskeys neat. Anytime you have high proof whiskey, cask strength, barrel strength whiskey, I always add water. I'll take a sip of it first, just to kind of get its natural form and impact, see what it tastes like. Sometimes you'd be surprised. Some of that 60% alcohol could be very mellow, and you're drinking and you go, wow, I can't believe that. I've tasted a couple of whiskeys blind, not knowing that they're barrel strength, and you go, wow, I could drink that as is. However, yeah.
I'm sorry. And barrel strength, that means it'll be stronger?
Oh, yeah. Barrel strength, it's when a whiskey is being matured in a barrel or a cask, as they would call it overseas. The whiskey's put in there at about 126 proof. When it comes out of the cask, it'll still be pretty high, probably about 120 proof. For most whiskeys bottled at 43%, they're going to bring that strength down quite a bit.
How do they bring the strength down? Add water?
Add water.
Okay, that's what I thought. Yeah. And now, just real quick, my impression from what you just said is just by aging it in the barrel, the proof will drop a little bit. Is that correct?
It does. Well, that's the angel share. That's what you hear about, the angel share. So the alcohol will evaporate. It varies from country to country. In Scotland and Ireland, typically the strength of the whiskey will go down. However, down in Kentucky, you have some whiskeys, the strength actually goes up. They can put it in at 126 proof, and then it'll actually go up to over 130 proof, because you actually lose more water than alcohol.
So some brands will actually bottle the whiskey at barrel strength and advertise it that way?
Yep.
Okay, yep. So barrel strength just basically means it's some powerful shit.
Sure. If you have a perfect example is Booker's. Booker's by Jim Beam. That is barrel strength bourbon right there. Over in Scotland, you'll often see cask strength, number of cask strength whiskeys.
Okay.
Same thing. You don't see it as much in Ireland, though I'm sure there are a number. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but typically Irish whiskeys come in at about 40% alcohol or 80 proof. Hey, come on. Got a visitor.
Nice. So could you just walk for people less experienced?
You there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you froze for a second.
Oh, sorry. So can you just walk people through sorry, let me write something down. I made a note to where to edit that. Can you just walk people through the basic way that Scotch, or I should say whiskey, is made, and then maybe if there's a differentiating factor between Scotch whiskey, Irish whiskey. Well, actually, let me back up. Could you just tell people the basic process of how whiskey is made?
Sure. So whiskey is a general term, just like wine is. And then within that umbrella of whiskey, you have different categories. So you have whiskey from Scotland, you got whiskey from Ireland, thus Scotch or Irish whiskey, Canadian whiskey, Canada. In the US, you have our staple is bourbon, but we have actually a plethora of different styles of whiskey going on in the U.S., including a new category that is coming online, the American single malt, which
Yeah,
will
I've been
share a
reading about
lot.
that.
Yeah, they'll share a lot in common with Scotch single malts, but with a few different rules. The Japanese make whiskey. You have whiskey coming from almost every country in the world now makes whiskey. Whiskey is a distilled spirit made from grain, typically barley or corn. Those are the most prominent ones. But you can make whiskey from just about any grain. I've seen whiskey made from rice. Obviously, have rye whiskey. So a lot of what you have to do first is come up with a mash bill. In Ireland, Scotland, they're very keen on malted barley. That's what you get, malted barley. So it's basically dried, roasted barley. In Scotland, a lot of people associate peat, just dead vegetation cut out of the ground and then smoked into the barley. That's what gives a lot of the Scotch that smoky character. However, only a small percentage, I think less than 20% of all distilleries in Scotland actually use peat to malt their barley.
I would love to understand how somebody came up with, oh, you know what? I don't like that patch of ground over there. Let's smoke it and put it in our distillation process.
Necessity. You can't. I mean, if you go to Scotland or Ireland, you realize it's quite wet over there. They don't have a lot of trees. And what few trees you have, you don't want to be just cutting them down to burn them. But what you had a lot of was earth. So you just go out there, you cut it up, you put it into a pile, probably in a little hut somewhere, so it's out of the rain. You let it dry for about 6 months. And then now you have these clumps of dry earth that when they burn them, oh, I love the smell of burning peat. That's great. And so that's why, that's how they used to dry the barley, was with peat, because it was their main fuel source. Nowadays, a lot of it is, forced gas air and stuff like that. So in the U.S., whiskey is made primarily from corn or rye. Canadian whiskey shares a lot in common with American whiskey. The Japanese have a lot more in common. They're kind of inspired by the Scots, so it's almost all barley. You take your cereal, you mix it up into a mash, you basically grind it up. It looks like oatmeal. You throw it into a big mash tun. You throw in water. Water sifts through it. And now you collect all this fermentable sugar as a wort. You throw that into another big container, add yeast. The yeast eats the sugar. Voila, you have alcohol. And at this point, what you have is beer. You take that beer, you throw it into a copper pot still, and then you boil it, separating the alcohol from the water. Alcohol collects its steam. You cool it back down to liquid. In Scotland, you typically distill a whiskey twice. Ireland, there's some distilleries that only distill twice, but it's always been very traditional and kind of thought of that the Irish distill 3 times. I know in Middleton and at Bushmills, they distill 3 times.
And
there's some
Scotch,
new
they don't distill 3 times?
Typically, no. Auchentoshan is the only real distillery that I know of. There might be a newer one that does it, but Auchentoshan does it 3 times, and that's about it. Everyone else is twice. And that I always associate the triple distillation with giving the Irish whiskey a lighter, sweeter character. And I think that's what really separates Scotch from Irish. Scotch just has a bigger, kind of sturdier character to it. Yeah. Irish whiskey is very sweet, very nice, gentle.
A little more delicate, in my opinion.
It is. And it's, that's what the beauty of whiskey is, that people can find these different characters. Then you go over to the US and the whiskey such as bourbon. Bourbon uses brand new barrels. It has to be at least 51% corn. If it's a rye whiskey, it has to be at least 51% rye in the mash bill. The rest is going to be a mixture of wheat, corn, barley. Usually barley is always mixed in there. But because they use brand new barrels, you got much bigger influence of the wood. The whiskey doesn't age as long, maybe anywhere from 2 to 6 years, maybe 9. But I don't think like older bourbons don't necessarily age as well as say older Scotch, because the Irish, the Scots, Canadians, the Japanese, even the Mexicans who make whiskey and some of their tequila are aged in old bourbon barrels. So the bourbon barrels are used once, sold off to these guys, and then the Scots and the Irish will definitely use those barrels over and over again. In Ireland, Scotland, Canada, it's a minimum of 3 years. I believe over in Japan is now a minimum of 3 years. In the US, fun little note, you know what the minimum age of a bourbon is?
Oh,
How long
years,
can
right?
it? Nope.
Actually, I know this. I did a video on it, and I can't remember now. I'm drawing a blank.
There
remember.
is no age minimum.
That's right. That's
Listed
right. The
for it to be
requirement is
called
on
bourbon.
the new bourbon barrel is on a new barrel, and it has to be charred.
You're cutting out, Curt.
Oh, okay.
Curt,
Yeah. Hold on. Can you hear me?
now make
you
a
hear
little
me,
mark there.
Yeah, I'm making.
Yeah, I hear you now.
Okay, so let's. Okay, you can hear me now.
Yeah.
Okay, it froze up. So okay, so let's back up. So yeah, so there is no minimum aging requirement on bourbon, but yeah, as I recall, the requirements has to be a new barrel and it has to be charred, if I'm not mistaken, right? Yeah,
That's correct. It has to be charred. Has to be at least 51% corn. And the thing with bourbon, Jimmy Russell gave an example once. He said, if you gave me a brand new oak barrel or a bucket, charred the inside of it, and I walked over to the still, filled it up with new make, walked across the lawn, poured it into a bottle, that's bourbon. Because
and
all it says is it must spend time in charred oak barrels.
now Tennessee whiskey, if I remember, isn't that bourbon that's just from Tennessee or Kentucky whiskey or?
Yeah, they won't tell you that, but that's basically what it is. I mean, that's the ongoing argument going back and forth. It's
So-
basically the same thing. They do the Lincoln County process, which is filtering it through vast vats of charcoal, usually maple charcoal, about 15 feet worth. But bourbons do that too. Maybe not a vat that big, but they'll be filtered.
So just so I'm clear, Tennessee whiskey and Kentucky whiskey, those are more like bourbon than whiskey. Is that? I mean, I know bourbon is whiskey, but they're more like a bourbon. Is that right?
Tennessee is more like a bourbon. Canadian whiskey can be it's kind of like a kissing cousin of bourbon because there's a lot of corn in there, a lot of rye.
And then Kentucky bourbon.
And Kentucky is all bourbon. I mean, I shouldn't say it's not all bourbon, but that's kind of like the home of bourbon.
Yeah. I got you.
It's
Okay.
Kentucky. However, bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States.
Right, I got that. But to call it Kentucky, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, it gets a little weird and convoluted. I mean, and now all states, there's a number of states like Indiana. New York already has its New York rye, Empire rye. So you make everything from ingredients make a rye whiskey with all the ingredients coming from the state of New York. That is an Empire rye whiskey. Indiana's trying to get its own designated,
Yeah. Funny you say that because I've been reading that, how like Europe, when it comes to wine and spirits, they're much more about the region and having strict rules in place as far as, hey, if you want to call it Scotch, it has to meet these requirements. Or if you want to call it Chablis, it has to meet these requirements and be from a certain place. I read recently that American whiskey, they're trying to aim for something like that. Have you heard the same or?
Well, it's a little difficult only because, with wine, the soil plays such a big part in that, right? They've been trying to check out what the tier noir is on whiskey, whether the location where you're maturing the barrels or casks. Um, if you're smoking it with something, if you're smoking the grain, like in the Southwest, they might use mesquite to dry the barley, which gives a beautiful mesquite aroma. Kilkeegan is a great whiskey from Santa Fe spirits. I highly recommend. But it will never really match what wine has. I mean, when I worked for Grand Marnier and a few other and Benedictine, and went over to France, and you talked about the Champagne regions and the chalky soil and how it affected the flavor of the grapes. I mean, that's something you don't get in whiskey.
Oh, plus, I mean, whiskey and bourbon's a lot stronger, and especially if you're adding peat, I don't think you're going to pick up on whether the soil is more chalky.
No, right. Well, like I said, the soil, depending upon where they're making the whiskey, like in Scotland, the grain, they're more concerned with the grain as far as the yield, how much alcohol it will yield, as opposed to saying Kentucky, they're really they think more about the yeast, because the yeast can affect the flavor. So, but I mean, there's different philosophies all over the place. Whiskey is not really made the same anywhere. I mean, yes, it's all distilled and stuff, but there's little nuances within the production that really change them up, make them quite different from one another. So if I did a blind tasting right now with you of a Canadian whiskey, and Canadian whiskey, actually, even though it's called Canadian whiskey because it's from Canada, go up to the Victoria Whiskey Festival sometime, and you will try a plethora of different whiskeys from Canada that will change your attitude about Canadian whiskey. So there's, but you'll always tell a Scotch compared to a bourbon. Those are very,
I'm not a huge bourbon fan. I'm more of a Scotch fan myself. Bourbon, I don't know. The older I get, the less sweetness I like in my alcohol, unless, maybe I'm having dessert and I have a, muscat with it. That's different because it pairs with the food. But I prefer the more kind of masculine.
Oh, yeah. I was the same way. I was a bourbon drinker in my early bartending days. Still love my Manhattans, but after a while, it does feel like my teeth are hurting. It's too sweet. Yeah. I need a Scotch to kind of dry things out a little bit.
Yeah.
Plus, you've got an Islay whiskey like Lagavulin is one of my favorites, or Talisker from the Isle of Skye.
Talisker is hands down. Now, admittedly, I'm not like a connoisseur of whiskey. I haven't tried dozens and dozens, but out of the the better ones I've had, I've always loved Talisker.
Yeah. Well, Talisker is fantastic with meals. If I'm having a steak, Talisker goes so well because there's a pepperiness and a saltiness to Talisker that just goes really well with a grilled steak. Lagavulin
steak will work. I used to be a chef, so the fat from the steak would also work with that too.
And Lagavulin, try it sometime with bacon wrapped dates. It's just a really beautiful combo.
Okay.
Yeah, or cheeses.
Awesome. So let's there's been let's talk about trends or American drinking habits. We've seen this huge rise in premium spirits, more so, I don't know, over the past 10 years, I guess.
Even longer.
Because my company, we're a promotional agency, and we go to stores, we do tastings and promote brands. And we've been doing more and more high-end spirits and tequilas. Well, that's a spirit. One, where do you think this uptick, this of just these premium spirits has come from? And two, well, let me start with that, and then I'll go on to the next question. Where do you think this is? I mean, because it's like this big wave. It's not like a few things here and there. I mean, it's pretty significant. Where do you think it's coming from?
I mean, there's a bunch of things. I mean, one, the brands have done uh, uh, have worked overtime in trying to get the word out on their products for the last 25 years at least. And then there's the thing we always noticed about 20 years ago when I was doing all these, when I was always doing these large consumer events, you'd see these young guys show up. And it was fascinating. The young guys would show up and they were basically saying they wanted to learn more about the whiskey because their bosses were drinking that whiskey. And they wanted to be able to communicate. They also want to kind of emulate them. And oddly enough, young women would come in. They'd want to learn about whiskey too. However, they weren't that eager to start drinking it, but they did want to talk on the same level as, again, their client or their boss. If they saw them drinking whiskey, oh, what whiskey are you drinking? Oh, was that a bourbon? Oh, I love bourbon. Oh, yeah, it's very nice. Was that nice caramely vanilla? You know, they wanted those little talking points, which I just thought was really interesting. I thought, wow, you're going to a lot of trouble just for a very specific thing, but God bless you, you're going to go far. Then in the late aughts, you started seeing bartenders really embrace the old cocktails. And anyone who's ever picked up an old bartender book from, the early part of the 20th century or even post-prohibition, it is either gin or whiskey cocktails. Vodka really didn't even start becoming a thing until maybe the 50s.
Yeah.
I mean, there was the Moscow Mule in the early 40s, but as far as loads of cocktails, I have a cocktail book from 1941. There are 3 vodka cocktails.
It was thought of as like this lower class thing. It was thought of very poorly.
In the 30s, it was being sold in the South as white whiskey. That's how it was being pushed. And that's the only sales they were getting until cocktails really kind of started to embrace them. Then James Bond, everything else. Anyways, bartenders started becoming little Indiana Joneses and looking into all these old books and bringing back old cocktails. I mean, you look at how the old fashioned has come back. When I was bartending in the 90s, the only people who drank old fashions were old people, usually old women. And it was the old kind of muddle up fruit kind, not the elaborate kind of mixologist version that you see now, which is truer to the original version of the old fashioned. Manhattans, Rob Roy's, anything that had a whiskey base, they're more profitable. This got more and more people into drinking cocktails. I was drinking whiskey cocktails. When I was young, I drank whiskey cocktails. And then, like you, I started weaning myself off the sweet and just started drinking them neat. So you have more and more people who are now embracing whiskey, and they may have come from the cocktail world. Now you have online whiskey groups galore. If you're on Facebook, there are more whiskey groups than you know what to do with. I'm constantly being invited to join whiskey groups, and there's just too many of them and too many of the same conversations usually, but they're also all jockeying for who can outdo the other person in the group. So what are they going to do? They're going to go look for those unicorns. So it's hard to get bottles, and usually the harder to get are the most expensive. Just the way it is.
Yeah.
Pappy Van Winkle. That's the whole thing behind Pappy Van Winkle. It's kind of crazy.
And have you noticed in your career anything, whether it be economic or societal, that tends to influence drinking habits more or less in particular?
Well, it's interesting. They did a study when I worked in Ireland for 2 years with Diageo, and they were doing a study out there, and it was called rocketing. That no matter what, no matter if the economy went south, if you were drinking high-end whiskeys, you stayed with high-end whiskeys. What you might stop doing is buying anything in between. You might buy low-end whiskeys, you might buy high-end whiskeys, but you weren't buying the middle range stuff.
Why is that?
Well, you want to stick with the high end because one, it might show that, hey, this economy is bad, but it's not affecting me. Whether it's true or not, doesn't matter. The low end stuff you're going to buy, say you're going to a barbecue. Well, you're not going to buy high end stuff, but you also weren't going to splurge too much on, say, a $50 or $60 bottle of whiskey for that barbecue. You might go see what, because it's probably going to go into a punch or into cocktails and figure so it's hard to say that, because right now whiskey is booming. American whiskey is on fire. Scotch whiskey was hurt a little bit by the tariffs, but actually even then, you still had, they're still doing great business, and Scotch whiskey has such great strangleholds in various markets, like in Asia and in Africa, and even in the Middle East, where you wouldn't expect a lot of people to be drinking whiskey. A house is not a home in India without a bottle of Johnny Walker Black. That's considered, having a bottle of wine or champagne handy for guests. So I don't know. Everything's on fire. Tequila is, I think it's just outsold. I think in total volume of sales, but not sales.
It's kicking ass.
Yeah, it's kicking vodka's butt.
The thing is whenever we do tastings with tequila, almost every single time somebody's like, no, I had a bad experience. And then I have to tell them, so listen, I get it. This is not like it. And then I usually go into my spiel and I tell them, I can guarantee you, and I say something like, how about this? Forget whether or not I make a sale. I don't even care about that. All I care about is I just want to change your perception, because this is not like the tequila you had before. 9 out of 10 times when people try it, they're like, oh, wow, I had no idea it could be like that. I said, that's fine, because that's why, because most people haven't had the experience of real tequila. I didn't even start liking gin until like a year and a half ago, because I tried Whitley Neal, because I turned 21 in 91. So, for the first, a majority of my adult life, the only gin that I saw was just like crap gin. I won't mention names, but this mass produced stuff. But, gin, like tequila and like whiskey and vodka, there's more and more premium small batch distilleries popping up. And I went to the Vine Expo show in New York City a few weeks ago, and I tried a gin from Vietnam. Fantastic. And what was cool is the aromatics, the botanicals they're using are stuff indigenous to Vietnam.
Right. That's why gins are
these flavors in it that's like, holy crap.
I went foraging in the Wicklow Mountains south of Dublin for botanicals that went into Glendalought's gin.
Oh, nice.
And I thought that was so cool, because she uses these fucking berries. Never heard of them before. But they also look like rabbit droppings. So I kept on picking up rabbit droppings until she corrected me. With people who do that whole thing where, I had a bad experience with that. No. You didn't have a bad experience. The tequila had a bad experience with you. You're the one who abused it. If you have one sip of tequila, you're not going to throw up. It's you having way too much tequila. It's having way too much of anything. You can get sick on too many bananas.
Of course.
And then I also mentioned to him, hey, you ever go on a bad date?
Yeah,
go on a bad date, didn't work out. Oh, did you never go on another date again? It's you get back up on the horse and you try it and you'd be really surprised. Plus, if you're talking about a bad experience you had in college or high school, your palate is a completely different palate.
Yeah.
You know,
That's true.
10 years, 20 years later.
And when you were a brand ambassador, um, you had to sell, right? Or did you just go educate?
No, I didn't like the term salesman, but I was. That's what we were doing. We were marketing, we were selling.
So
Um,
when you're marketing and selling, how would you say, if you could take the first half of your career to the second half, what have you learned now, and how has your approach changed to marketing and selling in the second half of your career?
well, a lot of it hasn't changed in some ways, in that even back then, I never wanted to sell somebody or get somebody to buy something that they didn't want, whether it was an account I went into or whether it was a consumer I was tasting out. I don't want you to buy this and not like it. I mean, what's the point of that? I don't want to
Yeah.
waste your money, and I hate to see a good bottle of whiskey go to waste.
Yeah.
Or nowadays, with my Glencairn glasses, I don't want you to buy them and them collect dust. Um, I ask them, what do you need? That's the most important thing when you're dealing with any kind of customer. What is it that you like? What is it that you need? I used to talk to folks who were never whiskey drinkers. You're never a whiskey drinker? Okay, do you drink wine? Yeah, I drink wine. Well, do you drink white wine or do you drink red wine? And those red wines, are they really big, bold ones, real dry? Are they kind of light, fruity, and sweet? Let me know where your palate is at. Or as a beer, do you like Miller Lite or do you like stouts? Do you like really, heavy stouts? Do you like high alcoholic stouts? Let me know. And then basically I'll find a whiskey for you that fits right in there. And now with the Glencairn glasses, I'll talk to a bar or a distillery and I say, look, do you have a tasting room? What are you selling? Do you have any branded items in your visitor center that you sell? Well, why not a whiskey glass that goes great with a bottle of your whiskey? And they're easy to put in their pocket and walk out. Plus, you probably just walked them through a tasting. So now they know exactly how to use that glass and drink your whiskey.
Okay.
So it's helping them. I think it's always finding out. The questions are always important. If you're not asking the person across from you questions, then you're kind of missing the point.
Now, so before we wrap up here, I'll just ask you one last question. And now, if I missed anything that you want to cover, I'll make sure we get that in there too. But liquor brands seem to be some of the best when it comes to branding and marketing. What do you think? What are they doing that other industries could learn from?
Well, one of the things that the big liquor companies do is that they recruit from other companies, from other fields. I mean, I had bosses at Diageo and at Bacardi who worked for Procter and Gamble. So they used to sell diapers. I go, oh, that's weird. So they brought marketing techniques. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Sometimes they took the attitude. I'd ask them, well, how are you going to, change your thinking? You're selling whiskey or vodka or gin or tequila to an adult, not a diaper. So how do you change, your approach? Oh, I don't. Oh, it's another product. I go, that ain't gonna work, because you do have to have a certain mindset. The thing is, with a lot of the big liquor companies, what you'll find is that there's a lot of trial and error. There's a lot of times they throw something against the wall and see if it sticks. It doesn't. I mean, they spend tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars on advertising and even brands. Well, they'll might Pernod Ricard bought Absolute for billion.
Wow.
Diageo bought that tequila brand off George Clooney for $1 billion. That's nuts.
Yeah.
To me, that's nuts. But they also have the power, they have the money to go out, advertise, sell, and hopefully make that money back.
Yeah. Is there anything I haven't covered that you want to cover?
Just that if anyone's interested, especially if you are a brand or a distillery or a bar, and you're interested in having your own branded Glencairn glasses.
Oh.
See, we do our nice little white etching. See,
Nice.
yeah.
Nice.
You can get that, or check out any of the other items that we have at www.glencairn, GLENCAIRN.co.uk. We're a Scottish family-owned company for 40 years, over 40 years. And the two sons of Raymond still run the company to this very day.
Wow.
With a lot of help from me. Big, important guy there.
Nice. Well, look, Martin, hey, I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your knowledge. I've learned a lot. And yeah, I again, thank you. I'll see you on LinkedIn, I guess.
You bet, Kurt. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Cool. And hey, before we hang up, just one quick question out of my curiosity.
Yes, sir.
So you were in, what was it, comedy or theater or both? Or
I did. Well, yeah, I started off in improv. That's where Steve Carell, myself, another guy in our group was a fellow by the name of Dick Costello. This little guy with sniffles and was always kind of rumpled looking. And that guy went on to create Twitter.
Oh.
Yeah. Oh my God. I was surrounded by, future millionaires. But,
The reason I ask is I've thought about, actually, I almost went into stand-up comedy when I left the chef profession.
mm-hmm.
Because I know I'm witty and, but I thought, well, my heart just wasn't enough to commit to it. And plus I know that, just because you're witty doesn't mean that, I'm not delusional. But I've thought about taking an improv class. I know Second City does them online. Do you think for somebody like myself who is in sales, I mean, I'm not like a salesman, but I do have to sell, whether I'm in the store or I'm cold calling clients to get new clients or cold calling prospects to get, hopefully they'll turn to clients. Do you think taking an improv class would help?
Big time. I started off at the Players Workshop of the Second City, which was an offshoot of Second City before they started up their own classes. It was started by Josephine Forsberg, who was one of the founding members of Second City. And the class was always full of people from, especially ad execs, people from advertising, anybody who wanted to do public speaking. And that's why I don't know about the online stuff, but I would definitely try to go somewhere where you can get up on stage, get in front of people, think on your feet. Someone gives you a who, what, and where, and now you're in a scene. And that's where, if you're witty, that's where your witticism really pays off, even more so than stand-up comedy. Plus, the fun thing is the whole idea in a scene is that you're supposed to save your buddy. So if you're struggling, there should be somebody on stage saying, "Hey, don't worry there, Kurt. I'll get that for you." Yeah, and kind of move the scene along. And so it's a great confidence builder. Does make you think on your feet. You start thinking more. It paid off a lot for me as time went on. I used it a lot behind the bar when I was bartending, and then when I used to bartend just one block down the street from Second City. So Chris Farley and a bunch of the guys used to come in all the time. We were right across the street from the Blues Brothers bar.
So it helps you with thinking on your feet and talking to people and speaking.
Yeah. You free associate, which is always great. Which helps you come up with new ideas, not only when talking with customers, but when you're sitting in the boardroom and trying to think of new ideas.
So
These
basically,
strategies,
the
new
class
plans.
just helps your mind in many ways.
It does, but I mean, if you want to pursue a life in acting, it also helps you with scene structure, character building.
And
Um,
so, in the class I would want to take is a class on improv. Is that the class? Was that what's called?
Improvisation. Yeah. Where are you, Curt? Where do you live?
Outside of Dallas.
Yeah, you should check around. There must be some kind of improv down there.
Yeah, I'll check it out. I just finished taking an email marketing course because I run this promotional agency. We're small. I mean, I have an assistant, but I don't have a background in sales, marketing, social media, and all this stuff. I've had to learn, especially over the past 2 years with the pandemic. That's the only good thing out of the pandemic is I was so busy just with the day-to-day of running the company. When the pandemic hit and we had to shut down for a while, it gave me a breather, and I was able to see like, oh, wow, I got to work on this. I got to work on this. I got to do that. Because when you're so busy just with the day-to-day, things are going to get neglected.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're so busy with the day-to-day stuff, you're not focusing on 3, 6, 12 months down the road. And so over the past 2 years, I've been learning content marketing, social media sales, marketing, branding. I just now recently learned how to do cold calling better. I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I used to think cold calling was a joke because I had no success with it, but I just recently learned, oh, wow, actually the problem is me. So yeah, there's a whole lot to learn, but I like it. So I've just been developing these skills, and
Yeah.
I don't have an HR department, I don't have a marketing department, and it's me.
Right. And so, like with cold calling, a lot of times I'll go to a market, I'll go to a city or an area that's having a whiskey festival, and I'll use that as my main reason for going. But I'll give myself a few days to go travel around and visit different distilleries. I almost never set up appointments. I just walk in. I introduce myself. I can look around, gives me a little lay of the land. I can see, they don't have much of a visitor center here, so they probably don't need a lot of glassware. However, I can always introduce myself, leave my card. Maybe they haven't even thought of having branded stuff yet. So I could be a help there. If not, fine. I'm leaving. Bye. Great to see you. And it's now I'm taking knowledge with me, one way or the other. But it gets you also ingratiated with folks who later on might become a huge brand. You never know.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you're thinking on your feet, you're walking in and you also feel comfortable. You're not going in there hemming and hawing. You're going, hey, how are you? Hi there. I'm Martin Duffy. You probably know me as the North American brand representative for Glencairn Crystal. They go, wow, he is smooth.
Yeah, I sometimes one thing I do sometimes is I'll just flat out say, hey, Martin, this is Curt Sassak from Winetasters Choice. Yeah, I'm going to be blunt with you. This is a cold call. Are you feeling adventurous? And that seems to go over well sometimes. In the beverage industry, people are always going from account to account, so they usually don't have a lot of time. So I think some people just appreciate the brevity. Just get to the point. Let me get on with my day. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, right. No, you got to read them. You got to make sure you're not taking up too much of their time. Other times, though, people love when you decide, hey, you know what? You guys serve food here? Oh, great. I'm going to have food. Or, you know what? I'd love to try your flight. He knows you have a flight of some of your spirits. I'm going to have sit down and try your flights. So you're not just this guy coming in trying to sell them. You're really trying to find out what are they all about. And I love hearing their stories too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, good. Hey, man, I'm going to let you go. Again, thank you so much, man. I think we went a bit over time, but thank you for sticking around.